The sound of a chainsaw tore through the quiet of the morning in Millbrook, Connecticut, rousing Daniel Cooper from his deep sleep. His 68-year-old eyes widened in panic as he recognized the direction of the noise, his historic orchard. In a matter of seconds, he threw on a robe over his pajamas and ran out of his colonial house, built by his great-grandfather in 1892. What he saw made him stagger. Betty Anderson, a 45-year-old woman with perfectly groomed blonde hair and designer gym clothes, was supervising a team of workers who were mercilessly felling century-old apple trees. Heavy machinery had already uprooted several trees, leaving deep holes in the land her family had cultivated for generations. "Stop! For God's sake, stop it!" Daniel shouted, running towards the workers. His heart was pounding as he watched the trees his grandfather had planted being destroyed one by one. Betty turned to him with an artificial smile on her pink-painted lips. Good morning, Mr. Cooper. Have you finally decided to join us at this historic moment for Millbrook?" "Historic? You're destroying history." Daniel gestured frantically for the workers to stop. "These trees are over 100 years old. They've been feeding the local schools for decades." "Progress, Mr. Cooper. Progress." Betty clapped her hands with rehearsed enthusiasm. "As chairman of the Youth Development Committee and self-appointed ambassador for local youth, I have a duty to create modern spaces for our young people. This old-fashioned orchard will be transformed into Connecticut's largest professional skateboarding rink." Daniel felt his blood boil in his veins. "You don't have the authority to do that. This land has been in my family since 1890. We have documentation." Betty pulled a set of papers from her Italian leather briefcase. "Actually, dear, as president of the Mill Valley Homeowners Association, I have every right. You see, your precious orchard was reclassified as an area of community interest at the last meeting." "What meeting? I was never notified of any meeting," Daniel protested, his hands shaking with anger and despair. "Oh, we sent an email." Betty shrugged, checking her perfectly manicured nails. "It's not my fault if you live in the last century and don't check your inbox." Daniel watched in horror as yet another century-old apple tree came crashing down. Those trees weren't just plants, they were living history. Each one had been carefully tended by generations of Coopers. The orchard supplied organic apples to every school in the county, a tradition that began with his grandfather during the Great Depression to feed needy children. "This is illegal. I'm calling the police." Daniel pulled out his cell phone, but Betty was quicker. "The police are already aware of the project." She smiled, waving to a car parked discreetly on the corner. "Officer Martinez is here to make sure everything goes civilly." Daniel recognized the young policeman waving gracelessly from the car. The same boy who, just a few years ago, came with his school class to pick apples in the orchard during the fall. "Betty, please." Daniel tried to appeal to the human side he hoped existed in that woman. "These trees feed hundreds of children. They're part of Millbrook's history. We can't just—" "History?" Betty interrupted with an artificial laugh. "Honey, history doesn't pay the bills. Do you know how much we're going to make from this track? The professional competitions, the sponsorships, the membership fees?" "Membership fees?" Daniel asked in disbelief. "Of course. You didn't expect it to be free, did you? We need to maintain a certain standard." Betty checked her luxury watch. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the investors in an hour. I need to show them the progress of the demolition." Daniel watched helplessly as more trees were felled. Each trunk that fell carried with it memories of generations. His grandfather teaching him how to prune the branches, his father showing him how to identify ripe apples, himself guiding groups of schoolchildren among the trees, explaining the cycle of the seasons. That same afternoon, as the last trunk was removed and the machines began to level the land, Daniel sat on the steps of his porch, silent tears streaming down his wrinkled face. Margaret, his 75-year-old neighbor, approached with a cup of tea. "It won't stay that way, Daniel," she said, taking a seat next to him. "Betty Anderson may have money and connections, but she doesn't have the right to destroy our historical heritage." Daniel nodded slowly, a determination growing in his chest. "You know something, Margaret? You're right. My grandfather braved the Great Depression to keep this orchard going. My father fought plagues and droughts. I'm not going to let some opportunist destroy our legacy. As the sun set over the remains of what had once been a thriving orchard, Daniel Cooper made a silent oath to the generations of his family who had farmed that land. He would fight, not just for his orchard, but for everything it stood for: tradition, community, and the simple goodness of feeding those in need. The next day, when Betty Anderson began to install the fences around the devastated land, she had no idea that she was about to face not only Daniel Cooper, but an entire community that had finally realized that some things are worth more than progress at any cost. The battle for the heart of Millbrook was just beginning. The news of the destruction of the Cooper orchard spread through Millbrook like fire through dry straw. The next morning, dozens of residents gathered in front of Mason's cafeteria, the town's traditional meeting place since 1920. The establishment, with its arched windows and original marble counter, overflowed with indignant voices. "My daughter cried all night," said Jessica Martinez, a teacher at Millbrook Elementary. "She doesn't understand why she won't be able to pick apples with her class this fall. How do I explain that someone just destroyed 100 years of history to build a skate park?" Rachel Mason, the third-generation owner of the coffee shop, was serving free coffee while coordinating an impromptu emergency meeting. Her grandmother had been one of the first beneficiaries of the Cooper's Apple donation program during the Great Depression. "We need to do something," Rachel declared, banging a spoon against the counter to attract attention. "Betty Anderson may have money and connections, but we have something more valuable. We have the truth on our side." Daniel Cooper entered the cafeteria at that moment, receiving a collective hug from the community. His face still bore the marks of the previous day, but his eyes shone with renewed determination. Margaret, his neighbor, followed him carrying an old folder. "I found something interesting in the municipal archives," Margaret announced, spreading yellow documents out on one of the tables. In 1943, when the government wanted to requisition the orchard for war efforts, a special decree was established protecting it as a historical heritage and essential community resource. A murmur of hope ran through the room. Daniel examined the documents with trembling hands. It means that Betty Anderson had no legal authority to destroy the orchard," added Howard Green, a retired lawyer who had represented the Cooper family for decades. "The reclassification as an area of community interest is completely invalid without a public hearing and approval from the Heritage Board." At that very moment, Betty Anderson entered the cafeteria, her high heels tapping assertively against the wooden floor. The silence was instant and icy. Well, what a lovely little meeting," she exclaimed with false sweetness. "I hope you're discussing how you're going to contribute to our new sports facility. Membership forms are now available, just $200 a month." $200? Josh Peterson, a local teenager, stood up indignantly. "You destroyed the only free place where we could spend time after school to charge $200? Betty adjusted her designer blazer. "Darling, quality has its price. Besides, you really need a more sophisticated environment than a decaying old orchard." "That orchard fed families," Rachel Mason interjected. "My grandmother survived the Great Depression thanks to the Cooper's apples. Every child in this town grew up learning about sustainable agriculture on that orchard." "Oh, please," Betty rolled her eyes. "You're being melodramatic. This town needs to evolve. Can you imagine how much real estate value we'll add with a professional sports facility?" Daniel stood up slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Betty, do you know the story of the oldest tree in the orchard? The one in the center?" Betty made a dismissive gesture, but Daniel continued. "In 1892, my great-grandfather planted that apple tree on the day his daughter was born. During the Great Depression, when families had nothing to eat, that tree fed dozens of children. In World War II, when the young men of the city went off to fight, we picnicked under its shade. Every apple it produced carried history." "History doesn't pay taxes, Mr. Cooper," Betty retorted, but her voice wavered slightly. "No, but it builds community," Howard Green intervened. "And speaking of laws, I have documents here that prove that your reclassification of the land was completely illegal." Betty's smile finally disappeared. "My lawyers. Your lawyers will love to see this." Howard held out the documents Margaret had found. A federal decree from 1943 protecting the orchard as a historic site. "No HOA has the authority to override that. The impromptu meeting quickly turned into an organized movement. Rachel Mason offered her coffee shop as the headquarters of the resistance. Howard Green began preparing a lawsuit. Josh Peterson and other teenagers created a social media page documenting the destruction of the orchard and its historical importance. Betty left the cafe visibly shaken, but before she left, she turned with one last blow. "You have no idea who you're messing with. I have connections that could make life very difficult for everyone here." "And we have something stronger than your connections, Betty," Daniel replied. "We have community." Over the next few weeks, as the machines continued to level the land of the old orchard, resistance grew. Peaceful demonstrations were organized daily. Local schoolchildren made posters with drawings of the old apple trees. The local newspaper ran a special series on the history of the Cooper Orchard and its impact on the community. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time since the orchard's destruction, Daniel Cooper felt hope. Looking at the determined faces that filled Mason's coffee shop, he realized that his family's true legacy lay not in the trees Betty had destroyed, but in the deep roots they had created in that community. Margaret put her hand on his shoulder. "You know, Daniel, your great-grandmother always said that a single tree can be blown down by any strong wind, but a whole orchard can withstand the worst storms." Daniel smiled, realizing that the spirit of the Cooper Orchard lived on in the heart of Millbrook, and no amount of money or influence could destroy that. As Betty Anderson's construction team continued to transform the old orchard into a future skate park, a quiet revolution was taking shape in Millbrook. The movement began on social media, where photos of the century-old apple trees being cut down went viral, attracting the attention of the regional media. The report from Hartford's Channel 8 arrived on a cloudy Wednesday morning. Veteran reporter Linda Chun was determined to cover more than just another local property dispute. She found Daniel Cooper sitting on his porch, holding an apple, the last one picked from the orchard before the destruction. "Mr. Cooper, did you keep this apple for any special reason?" Linda asked, adjusting her microphone. Daniel turned the fruit between his fingers, revealing its bright red skin. "This is a northern spy. My grandfather said it was the most resilient variety he ever grew. It survived blizzards, droughts, and even a plague that almost wiped out the entire orchard in 1962. It seems appropriate to keep it now, doesn't it?" The interview aired that night, but what really captured the audience's attention was the moment when the camera focused on the children of Millbrook Elementary, gathered where their favorite tree once stood, Grandma, as they affectionately called her. "We always used to picnic here," said 9-year-old Amy Sullivan, holding up a colorful drawing of the old apple tree. "Mr. Cooper used to teach us about bees and how they help the flowers turn into apples. Now Betty wants us to pay $200 to go skateboarding." The story quickly spread beyond Connecticut. Hashtags like #SaveCooperOrchard and #MillbrookResistance began trending in the United States. Environmentalists, historians, and community activists from all over the country expressed their support for the cause. Betty Anderson, however, did not back down. Instead, she stepped up her efforts, hiring a PR firm to manage the crisis. Her new narrative presented the skate park as a necessary urban revitalization project and painted opponents as resistant to progress. "We need to think about the future of our children," Betty declared at an impromptu press conference. "How many jobs will this project generate? How many championships will we be able to host? The orchard has had its time, but Millbrook needs to evolve." The community's response came in the form of an impromptu photo exhibition at Mason's cafeteria. Rachel Mason transformed the walls of her establishment into a visual timeline of the Cooper Orchard. Black and white photographs showed World War II soldiers saying goodbye under the apple trees. Images from the 1960s depicted civil rights demonstrators sharing apples during a peaceful march. "Each photo tells a story," Rachel explained to visitors. "This one is from 1978, when a storm devastated our region. The Cooper Orchard was the only place that kept its production intact, feeding families for weeks." Howard Green, meanwhile, discovered something even more disturbing in the municipal records. Betty didn't just violate the Historic Protection Ordinance, he revealed during an emergency town hall meeting. She forged property owners' signatures to get the land reclassified. "We have proof," The revelation hit the small town like a bombshell. Mayor Michael Sullivan, who until then had maintained a neutral stance, was forced to speak out. An official investigation will be opened to investigate all irregularities in the process. Betty countered with legal threats, sending warning letters to all those actively involved in the resistance movement. But her intimidation tactics had the opposite effect to that intended. Each new threat only strengthened the community's unity. On one particularly significant Saturday, more than 200 residents gathered on the devastated site of the old orchard. Each person carried an apple tree seedling, donated by nurseries from all over the state who had been touched by the cause. "We can't plant here yet," Daniel explained to the crowd, "but each of you will take care of a future tree in the new Cooper orchard. When we win this battle, and we will, these saplings will be our first plantings." The most moving moment of the day came when Josh Peterson, the teenager who first questioned the abusive price of the future state park, climbed onto a wooden box to speak. "Guys, I love skateboarding, but you know what else I love? Being able to sit under a tree after practice and eat an apple one didn't have to buy. Ms. Anderson thinks she's doing us a favor, but she's taking away something much more valuable. Our freedom to have a place that's truly ours." The young skateboarder's words provoked a wave of applause. Even some of the workers hired to build the track began to question their involvement in the project. Betty watched from afar in her late-model Mercedes, her expression increasingly tense. She hadn't counted on such resistance. Her plan to turn the orchard into a profitable venture was proving to be more complicated than anticipated. What she didn't realize was that every attempt to silence the opposition only fed the deep roots that the Cooper orchard had created in the community over generations. Like the northern spy that Daniel guarded, the spirit of Millbrook was proving to be far more resilient than she had imagined. That evening, as the sunlight set over the devastated land, Daniel planted the last apple from the original orchard. "From the seeds of this fruit," he told Margaret, "our next generation of trees will be born." Betty may have destroyed the orchard, but she can't destroy what it represents. The symbolic gesture marked a new phase in the battle for the heart of Millbrook. The community had found its voice, and not even all of Betty Anderson's connections and resources could silence it. The question now was no longer whether the orchard would be saved, but when and how its restoration would take place. The investigation into Betty Anderson's illegal actions moved slowly through Millbrook's municipal bureaucracy, while the construction of the skate park continued apace. Betty, feeling the growing pressure from the community, decided to change her strategy. Instead of direct intimidation, she began an aggressive PR campaign, hiring digital influencers to promote her revolutionary urban revitalization project. Imagine Millbrook on the extreme sports map, announced a polished commercial on all the local social networks. From an obsolete orchard to a center of sporting excellence. The glamorous images showed teenagers performing impressive maneuvers on a high-tech skate rink, conveniently omitting the $200 tuition fee. Daniel Cooper watched all this with a mixture of sadness and renewed determination. On one particularly significant morning, he received an unexpected visit from Marcus Thompson, a renowned environmental historian from Yale University. "Mr. Cooper," Marcus began, adjusting his glasses as he examined the documents spread out on the kitchen table. "Your orchard wasn't just a piece of land with trees. It was a rare example of continuous sustainable agriculture since the 19th century. The varieties of apples you grew are practically extinct in other parts of the country." Howard Green, who was also present, added, "And that makes our case even stronger. The destruction of the orchard was not only a violation of property, but a crime against historical and environmental heritage." Meanwhile, at City Hall, Mayor Sullivan was facing his own crisis. Leaked documents revealed that Betty had made generous donations to his election campaign weeks before the initial approval of the skate park project. The local press was having a field day with the revelations. Rachel Mason turned her coffee shop into a center of operations for the resistance movement. The walls, once decorated with old photos of the orchard, now also displayed evidence of Betty's wrongdoing. Copies of forged documents, suspicious payment records, compromising emails. "Look at this," Josh Peterson pointed to a newly discovered document. "The construction company Betty hired belongs to her own brother. They inflated the costs by over 300%. Betty, realizing that her position was becoming untenable, decided to make a bold move. On a Thursday afternoon, she called a press conference at the construction site. "Dear friends of Millbrook," she began, her professional smile as forced as ever. "In response to community concerns, I am announcing some modifications to our project. First, we will set aside an area for a small community garden. Second, we will offer scholarships to low-income young people." The crowd reacted with skepticism. One voice stood out. "What about the 100-year-old trees you destroyed? How are you going to make up for that?" It was Amy Sullivan, the 9-year-old girl, now holding a poster with pictures of the old orchard. Betty hesitated, her smile faltering for a moment. "Honey, sometimes we have to make sacrifices for progress." "Progress?" interrupted Daniel Cooper, who had arrived silently with Marcus Thompson. "Let me tell you something about progress, Betty. In 1932, during the height of the Great Depression, my grandfather developed an irrigation system that allowed the orchard to survive the worst drought in Connecticut's history. That's progress. In 1965, we implemented organic growing techniques decades before it became trendy. That's progress." Marcus Thompson stepped forward, holding up his tablet. "Ms. Anderson, I just submitted a report to the National Register of Historic Places. The DNA of the apple trees you destroyed had unique characteristics, developed through generations of careful cultivation. It was a priceless biological treasure." The press conference quickly spiraled out of Betty's control. Journalists bombarded her with questions about the irregularities discovered. Residents shared emotional stories about the significance of the orchard in their lives. That evening, while Betty hurried away in her Mercedes, Daniel remained on the grounds with Margaret and other residents. They watched the stationary construction equipment, ominous silhouettes against the evening sky. "You know, it's ironic," Margaret commented, holding up one of the apple tree saplings the community was growing. "Betty destroyed the orchard thinking she was eliminating an obstacle, but she ended up uniting the town in a way I've never seen in all my years here." Daniel nodded, touching the last Northern Spy apple he kept with him. "My grandfather always said that fruit trees are like people. They need time, care, and community to thrive. Betty may have destroyed the trees, but she couldn't destroy our roots." The battle for the heart of Millbrook was far from over, but for the first time, the tide seemed to be turning. As the sun set over the devastated land, Daniel imagined the future generations of apple trees that would one day grow there again, carrying on their branches not only fruit, but also the stories and dreams of a community that refused to be silenced. The courtroom at the Litchfield County Courthouse was packed that fall morning. Betty Anderson, impeccably dressed in a gray Chanel suit, sat rigidly next to her corporate lawyers. On the other side, Daniel Cooper, wearing his best suit, the same one he had worn to his daughter's wedding, was surrounded by a small crowd of Millbrook residents. "All rise," announced the bailiff. "The Connecticut Superior Court is in session. Judge Eleanor Blackwell presiding." Judge Blackwell, known for her acumen in environmental law cases, scanned the room over her reading glasses. "Case number 2023, CV 4872, Cooper versus Anderson and Mill Valley Homeowners Association. Suit for unlawful destruction of historic property and document fraud." The first testimony came from Professor Marcus Thompson, who presented scientific evidence about the unique biological value of the destroyed apple trees. "Your Honor, the Cooper Orchard was not just a collection of trees. It was a living gene bank, preserving varieties of apples dating back to the American colonial period." Betty shifted uncomfortably in her chair as Marcus projected satellite photos showing the before and after of the orchard. The contrast between the lush green canopy and the devastated land was shocking. "What about the legal aspect of reclassifying the land?" asked the judge. Howard Green stood up, holding a red folder. "Madam Judge, we have conclusive evidence that Ms. Anderson not only violated the 1943 federal decree protecting the orchard, but also forged signatures of property owners to approve the zoning change." The most impactful moment came when Josh Peterson took the witness stand. The teenage skateboarder had become an unwitting symbol of resistance. "Ms. Anderson sold us a lie," Josh declared, his voice trembling slightly. "She said it was for youth, but she charges $200 a month. Do you know how many of my friends can afford that? Zero. The Cooper Orchard? It used to be free. Mr. Cooper even taught us about farming on Saturday afternoons. During the lunch break, Betty tried one last desperate maneuver. She approached Daniel in the courthouse corridor. "Mr. Cooper," she whispered, "we can settle this amicably. How about a partnership? You get 30% of the profits from the track. We install some decorative vertical gardens." Daniel gently interrupted her. "Betty, you still don't understand. This was never about money." The afternoon session brought the most moving testimony. Amy Sullivan, the 9-year-old girl, specially asked to speak. "Last year," she began, holding up a drawing, "my mother got very sick. We couldn't afford fresh food. Mr. Cooper let us pick apples whenever we needed them. He said that the trees were our friends, that they looked after us." Silent tears streamed down the faces of several of those present. Even one of Betty's lawyers seemed moved. Judge Blackwell's decision was unequivocal. "This court finds that the destruction of the Cooper orchard was an illegal and morally reprehensible act. Ms. Anderson and the Homeowners Association shall: 1. Completely restore the land to its original condition. 2. Fund a recovery program for the lost apple species. 3. Pay substantial compensation to the Cooper family and the Millbrook community. 4. And Ms. Anderson is prohibited from holding any position in homeowners associations for 10 years. Betty left the courtroom in silence, her empire of influence crumbling. But the real victory came the following spring, when the entire Millbrook community came together to replant the orchard. Daniel, supervising the planting of the first seedling, developed from the seeds of that last northern spy, smiled at the sight of 3 generations working side by side. Josh Peterson and his skateboarding friends had designed a sustainable irrigation system. Schoolchildren decorated signs, identifying each variety of apple. Do you know what's most amazing? Betty thought she was defeating us when she cut down the trees, but she ended up strengthening something much deeper: our roots as a community. Rachel Mason handed out hot cider from her coffee shop, while Professor Thompson cataloged each new tree planted. Mayor Sullivan, after resigning and confessing his involvement in the scam, was now working as a volunteer on the restoration project. Dad called Sarah Cooper, Daniel's daughter, who had come home especially for the replanting. "I found this in Grandpa's things." She held up an old diary, open to a yellowed page. Daniel read aloud. "A tree takes years to grow, but its roots begin to strengthen the moment the seed touches the ground. A community is like that. Its roots are invisible to the eye, but they're what hold us firm through the storms." As the sun set over the new Cooper orchard, Daniel watched the small saplings, each one representing not just a tree, but a promise for the future. The orchard had been more than a battleground between progress and preservation. It had become a symbol of how a united community could stand up to greed and power. And when the new trees would take years to bear fruit, but the seeds of something even more precious had already blossomed in Millbrook. The realization that true progress lies not in destroying the past, but in building on its more solid foundations. "For generations to come," Daniel whispered, touching the thin trunk of a sapling. And deep in the rich Connecticut soil, the roots were once again beginning their silent work of weaving together the future of a community that had rediscovered its strength.